Welcome to Stacktastic, the weekly web show for the avid comic book reader and those who aspire to become so. Now, for some reason, both DC and Marvel are having major comic book events in the fall. Is it a scheduling snafu, talent running late, outside-of-the-box thinking, or if comic book movies push comic books out of the summer? After all, our budgets are only so big. Regardless, right now we're smack in the middle of DC Villains Month, Infinity, and Battle of the Atom. Today I'll review all three and let you know if you should make room for any of them in your increasingly taxed budgets. Plus, as always, we'll look at what comics to pick up or download this week. Let's get started. Before Watchmen got a lot of bad press, mostly in defense of Alan Moore, but personally I thought it was a pretty good event, largely due to the talent involved. Which is interesting because there seems to be a considerable lack of talent when it comes to DC Villains Month. I have a feeling that's due to the sheer size of the event, which did make for an impressive display at Midtown Comics. Not only did all the DC Villains Month titles with both 3D and non-3D covers seem to stretch as far as the eye could see, but there was the added bonus of smushing competitor Marvel's titles all the way to the back of the store. Ah, corporate rivalry. But as I flipped through the multitude of DC Villains titles to see which ones I should pick up, I was taken aback by the poor quality of most of the artwork. Little did I know that most of the writing would be equally poor. So far, I really only ended up buying the Batman books because of my affinity for those villains. But I was really disappointed to see that instead of fleshing out the spine of DC Villains Month, Forever Evil, these issues were simply standalone stories about their respective villains, with appalling violence. Now, I totally understand that these are stories about villains, but almost all the violence seemed to be just for the sake of violence. None of it was creatively or emotionally earned, and therefore none of it resonated. DC's view of evil seems to be surprisingly sophomoric, which is weird because villains have always been one of their strong points. Plus, at what point will the publisher realize that you can't define a character, or even worse, tell an origin story, in a single issue? The best DC Villains Month title I've read to date is Scott Snyder's inventive take on the Riddler. The worst was Andy Kubert's Joker snuff comic. And the most confusing, newcomer Marguerite Bennett's odd attempt to turn Lobo into DC's version of Gambit. However, I thought that Forever Evil #1 was pretty solid, so I'm definitely going to continue reading that main title. But it really is a shame that story isn't being fleshed out in the other DC Villains Month titles. Also, I have to admit, because I dropped Trinity War, I have no idea what happened to the Justice League, and I'm not at all compelled to go back and find out. Finally, I suspect this basic story might be being told in a much better fashion off in the Injustice title, which has been a sleeper hit and which I think I'm going to have to go back and pick up at this point. Hickman! You just can't help yourself. Once again, Infinity is lapsing into my usual problems with Jonathan Hickman's work, and then it gets too philosophical and existential. Now, I totally understand that Hickman has his legion of fans, but I just don't think he belongs on a blockbuster event, as he keeps it from being a fun read, which should be the #1 goal of any blockbuster event. So as Infinity continues, I am still immensely enjoying the diplomatic adventures of Corvus Glaive, a character so well written that Marvel should consider giving him his own title at this point. His thinly veiled threats to heads of state, most notably Black Bolt, are just as exciting as any battle scene. Speaking of Black Bolt, though, there's a pretty good reveal at the end of Infinity #2, and I'm very curious to see how this all plays out and potentially factors into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But the parallel storyline of the Avengers in space is super dense, both in terms of being too talky and overloaded with characters. I still don't understand why Hickman felt it was necessary to expand the Avengers roster to the breaking point, and the team not only lacks clear leadership, but is burdened with a number of new characters that have yet to be clearly defined. One enigma can be intriguing, but several just comes across as poor and overly ambitious planning. Have I given up on Infinity? Certainly not. And art from the likes of Jim Cheung and Jerome Opeña does help. But it makes me realize how much I miss Brian Michael Bendis and what's become Marvel's flagship line thanks to Hollywood. Or has it? It would seem that Bendis is the magic ingredient when it comes to Marvel's titles, and wherever he goes, readers follow, at least this reader. After a rudderless era in the X-books under Matt Fraction, who himself is much better off over on Hawkeye where he's brilliant, Bendis has re-energized the mutant titles with his uncanny ability to highlight classic X-Men elements and then cleverly update them. Who didn't love hearing Kitty Pryde say, "To me, my X-Men"? See, just as his X-Men books were beginning to stall, almost on cue, here comes potentially the best X event since Age of Apocalypse. Avengers vs. X-Men does get honorable mention, not so much for its storyline, but how it had lasting changes on the X universe. We can only hope the same will happen here. And so far, so good, as 3 parts into Battle of the Atom, which will be 10 parts in total running through October, so many fascinating things have already happened. Another group of merry mutants decides to jump through the timeline from the future, and the roster of this team is a perfect example of Bendis' clever yet subtle storytelling. The highlights are the return of Xavier, his grandson, with those classic almost alien eyebrows, and Molly Hayes from the Runaways, all grown up, as a unique cross between Rosie the Riveter and She-Hulk. I'm sure there are more surprises in store for us, like one I don't want to ruin if you haven't started reading yet. Bendis is clearly taking his time, just as he did so successfully with Secret Invasion, which led into Civil War, the high point of his time on the Avengers titles. Finally, I love how while Grant Morrison made Jean Grey more godlike, Bendis takes her younger version in the opposite direction, making her very human. Bendis paints Jean as someone who knows she's the dream girl of quite a few X-Men, and she's not against playing into that to manipulate them. Manipulative is such an obvious character trait for a telepath, I'm amazed no writer has thought of it before. Sure, Battle of the Atom could end up disappointing, but so far, it's golden. These 3 mega events all continue this week, but there are some comics worth picking up outside of them as well. I'm actually going to start by recommending a graphic novel, Batwoman Volume 3, World's Finest. Kate Kane has been in the headlines a lot lately, so if that's piqued your interest, I think this story arc is your best bet when it comes to J.H. Williams' run as writer on the book. Of course, it doesn't compare to Greg Rucka's run, but the Batwoman and Wonder Woman team-up is not only a clever take on the classic Batman-Superman team-ups, but for once seems to be almost on the same level. Then over at Marvel, Jason Aaron's impressive run on Thor starts its own new story arc with number 13. I'll miss Esad Ribick's art, but Ron Garney, who wowed with Get Mystique, is an awesome and distinct change of pace. And I'm going to keep recommending it until you pick it up, Mark Waid's Daredevil. If you enjoy Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's work, this is right up there. Meanwhile, Victor Gischler, infamous for turning Jubilee into a vampire, resurfaces over at Dark Horse with Kiss Me Satan #1. This time, he's all about witches, demons, and werewolves. I'll bite. Another writer who resurfaces this week is Alex Cott, one of the many recent talents to part ways with DC over creative differences. Cott, who left Suicide Squad, is now at Image with the debut of Zero, where a spy finds himself in a race to acquire a living weapon. And finally, my comic Superbia #11 hits shelves this week with plenty of reveals in store, some that have been building since issue #1 of the miniseries. And that's this week's Stacktastic. I'm Grace Randolph for Think About the Ink, and hope to see you back on Friday for Between the Pages. Until then, happy reading.